In April 1945, President Roosevelt died and was succeeded by his vice president, Harry S. Truman, a deceitful and opportunist politician with a limited education and worldview. This is, of course, contrary to the myth that has been spun around Truman, who's been sold as a plain-spoken, honest everyman. The myth around Truman is part and parcel of the myth of the atomic bombings of Japan. Truman was thus thrust onto the center stage during the midst of a world war. On the other hand, Nazi Germany had collapsed, and the Japanese were begging to surrender in the face of the massive firebombings of its civilian population. But the ear of the newly inaugurated president was dominated by the voice of his Secretary of State, James Burns. Burns has remained a shadowy historical figure, yet he, more than anyone else, is responsible for the decision to drop nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With the defeat of Germany, Leo Szilard, the man most responsible for initiating the Manhattan Project, desperately tried to get the horses back in the barn. He frantically tried to arrange a meeting with the new president, but was referred to James Burns. Burns informed Szilard that it was necessary to drop the bombs on Japan to persuade the Soviets to withdraw their troops from Eastern Europe after the war. Szilard countered that we might start an arms race between America and Russia, which might end with the destruction of both countries. Burns remained unmoved in the face of this argument. After his frustrating meeting with Burns, Szilard turned to Oppenheimer, only to be rebuffed by him as well. The horses of the apocalypse were now galloping. The discussion amongst the high government officials charged with overseeing the atomic bomb project centered on how to build up a stockpile of nuclear weapons, with the decision to drop the bomb on Japan now a foregone conclusion. The group was presided over by the Secretary of State, James Byrne, and included Secretary of War, Stimson, who would later deliberately write the lie in an essay in Harper's Magazine that the bombs were dropped to defeat Japan. As the group moved toward selecting large civilian targets, that is, cities, Oppenheimer vigorously argued for the slaughter of massive numbers of Japanese civilians. Yet, as we saw earlier, Oppenheimer's initial rationale was to beat the Nazi atomic bomb project. The timing of the first test was deliberately set to occur a few days before the Potsdam Conference, set for mid-July, where Truman and Churchill were to meet with Stalin. On July 12, 1945, the first nuclear bomb was exploded. Years later, in recalling the event for a television documentary, Oppenheimer said that in witnessing the massive explosion created by his efforts, he thought of a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I become death, the destroyer of worlds." It is a sentimentalized quote suggesting an unintended awe and abject admiration for his creation. The Americans and the British discussed at great length before the Potsdam Conference how Truman would inform Stalin that the West now possessed a successfully tested atomic bomb. Truman wrote in his diary after the meeting, "I casually strolled over and mentioned to Stalin that we had a new weapon of unusual destructive power. The Russian premier showed no special interest. All he said was that he was glad to hear it and hoped he would make good use of it against the Japanese." Stalin, of course, knew full well what Truman was talking about. The Soviets were well underway with their own secret atomic bomb project, receiving technical information from the two spies at Los Alamos. And so, astonishingly, the gauntlet to start the nuclear arms race of the Cold War was dropped by innuendo in an absurdly foolish schoolboy game of footsie between Truman and Stalin. Two very dangerous and reckless men, quite capable of destroying the world. 2 weeks after the Potsdam Conference, on August the 6th, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on another civilian target, Nagasaki. After the first bombing, Oppenheimer was initially elated. However, after the second, of which the scientists had not been informed by the military, Oppenheimer was filled with guilt and remorse. After the bombings, Oppenheimer began to make his reservations known. In public speeches, he openly admitted that the bomb had been used against an essentially defeated enemy. However, at the same time, privately, he endorsed draconian legislation for surveillance and severe penalties against scientists suspected of being a security risk. Oppenheimer met once and only once with Truman. It was a few months after the bombings. Oppenheimer wanted to express his concerns about a developing nuclear arms race and a resultant nuclear world war. Truman, on the other hand, wanted to bully Oppenheimer into giving him full control over the weapons by putting them solely in the hands of the military, far from the reach of the scientists. The meeting went badly for Oppenheimer. The often articulate Oppenheimer became tongue-tied and emotional. At one point in the meeting, he said to Truman, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." This display of guilt embarrassed and repulsed Truman, who said after the meeting, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch crybaby scientist in my office again." The scientists did indeed lose control of the weapons they created. And although the Soviets offered to negotiate a ban on the production and use of nuclear weapons in June of 1946, they were rebuffed by the Truman administration, leading us directly to the stockpiles and proliferation of nuclear weapons we see today. Oppenheimer, in turn, continued his pattern of vacillation between public protest and private acquiescence for the rest of his life. The human brain contains its own evolutionary history. It exists solely for its own survival. Its purpose is no greater and no less. But it is an organ at odds with itself. Its attempt to survive may also be its undoing. The human brain, in appearance, resembles a cauliflower. At its base, from an evolutionary perspective, is its oldest part, the brainstem, and its outer leaves the most recently evolved cortex. In between both anatomically and in terms of evolutionary age is the midbrain. The brain is a vastly complex organ with billions of cells that communicate through 100 different neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers that travel between charged nerves. Each of these parts speak continuously to the others. Like the layered seams of the earth, they reveal the path of human evolution as it emerged from the sea and rose to walk upon the land. Our rudimentary reptilian brainstem keeps our hearts beating and our lungs breathing. Our cortex, amongst many other things, receives and processes new information. But the real action is in the midbrain. It is here that our emotions and pre-programmed instincts reside. It is here our ravenous appetites for survival drive our behavior. The midbrain contains the brain's self-reinforcement system through the release of a chemical called dopamine. The brain experiences the release of dopamine as thrilling and exciting and is therefore driven instinctually to directing our behavior in ways that maximize its release. These behaviors include sexuality and aggression. The creationists are insulted by the idea that we are primates, but the evidence is there for all to see. In a police lineup with, say, a turtle, a zebra, and an ape, it's not hard to pick out who our cousin is. It is this illusion of exceptionalism, of being special, whether as a species or a group, which is at the root of the denial and rationalizations of war. Our closest cousin, the chimpanzee, shares 98% of the same DNA as we do. Humans genetically are more closely related to chimps than our gorillas. Chimpanzees hunt in groups of males who attack and kill not just prey, but other chimps that intrude on their perceived territory. Like human societies, they are instinctually male-dominated, with the submissive females attracted to the more aggressive males. It is out of this species that our species, Homo sapiens, evolved 2 million years ago. Thus, our midbrains are pre-programmed for the same behavior. Evolution can be broken down into two facets, biological and cultural. Biological refers to the physical changes in the brain, cultural to the things it produces, both materially and non-materially. The major gross structural changes in the human brain plateaued around 250,000 years ago. On the other hand, cultural evolution has grown exponentially. Cultural evolution has led to the large, complex societies we live in today. On the other hand, it has led to nuclear arsenals and a major disruption of our habitat. Thus, weapons and other products of cultural evolution no longer offer survival advantage for some, but rather they now threaten the existence of us all. Hope lies in the learning. The brain has the capacity to literally rewire itself. This quality is called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity involves the rewiring of existing neural networks. Thus, the incorporation of experience alters the brain. We are witnessing the societal norms surrounding violence changing drastically, despite the continuation of armed conflict. It has become less and less tolerated. For example, domestic violence. In order to achieve this cultural shift, changes have taken place in the neural pathways that go from the front of the cortex to the midbrain. This neural network inhibits the violent behavior driven by the midbrain. Thus, through learning, humans do, in fact, have the ability to restrain their primate selves. The challenge lies not in self-restraint, but in self-deception, the rationalizations of war.